I never let upon an opportunity to come to the Nilgiris. This is where I spent my growing up years. You call this conference Nilgiri Escapes. For me, it has been and always will be a Nilgiris escape. And I'm happy about it. What I thought I would do today, as I've always done, even in the on the last occasion, is to share my experiences with handling cases involving human-animal conflicts, human-environment conflicts, and most importantly, to open up the workings of a judicial institution in our country. Because I think it is important for you to know that the judiciary, you must understand as citizens, the limitations that afflict the judiciary when it comes to dealing with matters involving environment and more specifically human-wildlife conflict. So how does the judiciary actually deal with any case before we get into environmental cases? For starters, it's all about perspective. We apply the written law of this country to a given factual situation that comes before us. The catch is that when it comes to interpretation of a written law, it depends pretty much on the perspective that an individual judge has as to how to interpret the law. Now, you might think this is all empty rhetoric, but let me give you an example. And this is my favorite example. I tell this, I talk to students, I talk to judicial officers who I train in the Judicial Academy. Let me give you just one simple sentence, and it'll drive home the point. If somebody were to say, you cannot expect change, sometimes you have to bring the change. Listen to that sentence carefully. You cannot always expect change. Sometimes you have to bring the change. Now, if I told you that this was words of wisdom by some great Eastern philosopher, what would the meaning be of that sentence? I'm guessing that you would think that, you can't expect change in the world unless you put your heart and soul into it, and you need to bring that change which you wish to see in the world, right? That's one way of looking at it. That's one perspective. Now, suppose I change the narrative a bit and I tell you this was an utterance of one Mr. Krishnamurthy, who was a bus conductor in the Kerala State Road Transport Corporation. What would that sentence be now? Yeah, you need to bring change because I don't have change, right? Now, this is what happens when you start interpreting statutes, interpreting the law. There is no absolute truth in this world. There is only everything that you hear is an opinion. Everything that you see is a perspective. And therefore, when you're called upon to interpret a law, you bring your life experiences into the equation, into the scenario, and you need to interpret law in the manner that appeals to you. And this is where the problem begins when it comes to environmental legislation and interpretation of the environmental legislation. Now, why do I say that? Look at the existing legislation that we have in our country. You have the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, 1960 vintage. You have the Wildlife Protection Act, 1972. Both these legislations are truly anthropocentric, which means that they prioritize the interests of human beings and not other species in this world. There is a sense of domination of the human over all the other species in this world. So it's anthropocentric. In 2002, and although we had the UN Convention and the International Agreement in 1972, I think, the Rio de Janeiro Declaration. And sometime, I think, in the 1980s, we had India actually was a signatory to the Biodiversity Convention. We got the law only in 2002, the Biodiversity Act. For me, that was the truly ecocentric legislation that we had in our country. But look at what's happening now. That ecocentric legislation was amended as late as in 2024. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1973 was amended sometime in 2022 or 23, but only for limited purposes, which was basically to include more animals, more species into the schedules of the Wildlife Protection Act. But in the interests of international trade and nothing more. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act has remained unamended all these years. So we have a mixed bag of legislation which we are called upon to interpret. You have anthropocentric legislation, you have it side by side with ecocentric legislation. What is the philosophy that is supposed to guide the interpretation in law? You will all agree, you're all men of science. Ecocentric does not gel with anthropocentric as a philosophy. They're mutually contradictory. And it's no surprise, therefore, that when you hear judges interpreting the law in different courts, viewpoints differ depending upon the life experiences of the particular judge concerned. So if you really want to have a uniform application of the laws, a uniform philosophy of informing the interpretation of the laws, what you need is to have a reimagination or an amendment of our legislation. In fact, bring about meaningful legislation covering all these areas and let it be ecocentric all through. The second aspect which I want to highlight here is that we also need to, once we have a common philosophy or common worldview which informs our interpretation, we also need to inculcate a sense of accommodation of the interests or of the rights of other beings. We just heard Jane Goodall. The ethnographic kind of research that must inform any scientist, either an anthropologist or a social scientist, you have to have an ethnographic approach. And by ethnographic, I mean that you need to go, in order to understand the other, you need to go to that other's territory. You need to go to, if you want to really understand, the tribal community or the tribal living, you need to actually go and spend some time with them. So understanding the other is an important approach, is an important aspect of, I think, application of laws as well. There was an interesting viewpoint given by Argentinian legal student or legal researcher named Maria Lugones. And this was in the context of studying intersectionality. And she said it would be encouraging if everybody adopted what she calls a world traveler approach. Now, when you actually travel the world, if you're really interested in another country and its culture, you would try to mingle with the people in that country. You would try to understand their culture, the culinary aspects of their culture, their traditions, and you would try to relate to that. but most importantly, you would respect those. If we had a similar approach in understanding the other in our society, and in the context in which I'm speaking now, if you understand the other species in this world, I think that attitude would go a long way. And lastly, I just wanted to flag the citizen participation method, which I have found particularly useful when I'm sitting in judgment over these cases. You talk about community participation in the context of the biosphere. And that I think is one of the central aspects of the Man and Biosphere program of the UNESCO. But in cohort, I have found this to be particularly useful, especially in the years following COVID. In Kerala, we had a situation during COVID. The state government came out with something called the Jagrata Samitis, and it just means small groups of people who would alert the powers that be of anything that was going wrong in the area. Now, this Jagrata Samitis were helpful in gathering information at the grassroots level and transmitting up to the policymakers or the decision makers so that they could control the pandemic. What started during the COVID period, I implemented subsequently when I was called to monitor or regulate the street vendors in the Cochin, operating within the Cochin Corporation. I formed Jagrata Samitis or task forces in each ward of the corporation. And those Jagrata Samitis would be comprised of a station house officer of the local police station, the ward member of the corporation, and a member from either the resident association or the commercial establishment association. Now, these people in each ward would alert the monitoring committee of any illegal or unauthorized street vendor operating in those areas. And this helped so much because the monitoring committee I had in place consisted of the district collector, the mayor, the district police chief. There was an amicus curiae who was a friend of court, who was a court-appointed lawyer. And these people would sit as the monitoring committee 24/7. They would get messages on their WhatsApp alerting them about an unauthorized street vendor operating in the area. And the action was immediate. They did not have to wait to come to court and get orders from me. So this real-time monitoring of the situation with the help of local people participating really effectuates the law and helps in the implementation of the laws and regulations. Now, after my experiments with the street vendors, I thought this is a good idea, and this is a good methodology that I can adopt for the purposes of human-wildlife conflict situations, which are on the increase in Kerala even as we speak. So what I did was I constituted task forces at the local level. And especially in two areas. One is in Kannur, where you must have heard about the Arlam farm, and the other is in Wayanad. Now, Wayanad poses a peculiar problem because of its terrain. You have human settlements crisscrossing with forest areas, so you don't have clearly demarcated areas of forest and human settlements. Arlam farm is a central farm which was constituted by the state government. I think they bought the land from the central government, and they divided it into three zones. The first was the farm area, where they intended to cultivate crops, and it was doomed from the start because the crops that they wanted to cultivate was coconut, jackfruit, bananas. Not the best of crops to be growing on the side of or the fringes of a forest. Then they had a zone which was called the tribal resettlement zone. which was the idea was to help tribal communities resettle after bringing them from outside the core areas of the forest. The plan was good, but the implementation went awry because the tribals that they resettled in Arlam were not from anywhere near Arlam. So they actually brought tribal communities from Kasargod and from Wayanad and resettled them in Arlam. Obviously, a tribal community that is uprooted from somewhere else and brought into another forest knows nothing about that forest. And so the whole objective is defeated. And to make matters worse, in Arlam, the tribal communities are not those who live together in enclosed spaces. They're scattered. Now imagine the logistical nightmare in having to protect individual homesteads that are scattered throughout a tribal resettlement area, which runs into hundreds of kilometers, and animals in the core area attracted by the crop that is being cultivated there. So this was not working, and the solution that the state government came up with to prevent animals from encroaching into the tribal resettlement areas was something like what Mr. Trump did in the context of Mexico. So they started building this wall. It's a 10-kilometer wall, which is built from one end to the other of the forest, and with the hope that at the end of that 10-kilometer, the animal would understand the boundaries and not cross, because the end of the 10 kilometers is where the Kerala border ends. And therefore, this was what was happening. And there were breaches in the wall, thanks to the fantastic workmanship of the PWD. In the other areas, where they could not build the walls, they resorted to hanging fences powered by solar energy. Now, elephants, they thought that the elephants would stop coming into the area, but it didn't. The breaches in the wall helped. The solar fences were not working. So this was creating a veritable nightmare for the tribal people and also the people actually working in the farm. So I decided to actually go and visit the place. Because the stories that come to court are through affidavits. Somebody sitting in Trivandrum is, signing a paper that is prepared by somebody else sitting somewhere else, none of whom are actually in Arlam. Now, you can't decide a case, an environmental issue or a wildlife conflict issue based on affidavits. So I decided I would go there. And I went to Arlam. I saw the wall. I saw the settlements. I interacted with some of the tribal community members. And at the end of it, I actually had a discussion with the local, the district collector there, and also the panchayat members, the president panchayat, and also the forest officials. And I gave them an idea of what I felt as a layman. And I said, maybe you need to reimagine the solution here. I know you've been at it for the last 10, 15 years, but maybe you need to reimagine because things are not going the way you wanted. As luck would have it, when I asked the chief secretary, because now we have the video conferencing in court, so it's easy to summon any of these bureaucrats to come and through video conference, they can attend the court proceedings. The chief secretary obliged, and he, along with the chief wildlife warden, entered into a video conference with us. And I'm happy to report that the chief secretary actually agreed that the situation in Arlam farm needed a reimagination and the solution had to come different from what was happening now. And one of the things he mentioned was that we would have to go for a phased recultivation program. So it's not going to be the same crop. And he said, Kerala is known for its spices. And if you start replacing the coconut, jackfruit, and the bananas with spices, pepper, ginger, turmeric, you've got a win-win situation because that's going to contribute to the economy. It's going to be keeping the wild animals away because elephants, I'm told, I mean, Mr. Sukumar here would tell me better. Elephants, I'm told, are not particularly attracted to spices. At any rate, they're not as attracted to spices as they are to bananas. So that thinking is going on. And I think we're working on those lines. Hopefully, we should find some positive results there. And as for this tribal area, one thing that we're thinking about is relocating the tribals from the tribal resettlement area into the farm area, giving them employment in the farm so that they're not dependent only on, because what was happening was the tribal people were resettled in this area. They were given patches of land with the crop for them to cultivate and take the yield as a source of income. We are now thinking of resettling them in the farm area and employing them in the farm so that their livelihood now comes not from the crop, but from labor as farm laborers. And then this tribal resettlement area would act as a buffer zone and separating the wild animals from the farm area. So, I mean, that's one way of approaching the problem. When it comes to Wayanad, again, constituting task forces, we've had local people forming task forces together with tribal people. And they, what we've done is we've constituted these task forces. The task forces are not to interact with the forest and the revenue authorities. The task forces collect data, suggest measures for to be taken for preventing wild animal incursions into the settlements. And I've asked them to report directly to us in court. Now, why do I do that? When I get the suggestions from the task forces, this is the people directly communicating to us. We filter some of the totally, absurd suggestions we ourselves filter. And that must be something that doesn't appeal to common sense at all. And then what remains, we put it to the state and ask them for their suggestions and their comments on these suggestions. And if it is workable, then the state government informs us that this is something that we can look into. We top it up with a direction by us to the state government to implement it. This works because it's not based on our knowledge of scientific matters. And I do confess, I have no difficulty in confessing that, when it comes to scientific knowledge, we are not specialized for this. We don't have it. And prudence demands that we always listen to the scientific community for that. We do it all the time when it comes to trials, when it comes to a criminal trial or a civil trial, when it comes to expert evidence. Evidence has to be led in by calling the expert. Why is it that we don't do it in our public interest litigations or in the writ jurisdiction? So this is something that is working. We're listening to the scientific community. We're getting their advice. And in Wayanad also, in the last couple of months, we've had some success with getting measures or getting suggestions in a timely manner so as to enable us to take suitable protective measures. But I think the key lies in trying to bring about an awareness among the people at the grassroots level. And this, I think, is where we need to focus more. We are taking those steps in the judiciary, like we've got a scheme implemented through the National Legal Services Authority. I spearheaded that, and I wanted it included as a specific scheme in the National Legal Services under the National Legal Services Authority. A scheme was formulated, and now we're having the first conference based on that in Trivandrum next week. The idea is that you could take this knowledge to the villages, to the farm, to the most remotest areas, and more specifically to those areas where the human settlements about the forest areas. So hopefully, with increased awareness among the people, there would be timely uh, intimation to the judiciary with regard to the areas, with regard to a threat perception. And we would be, in turn, able to alert the bureaucrats about the need for emergency action. So I see the role of the judiciary today in these situations as a via media, or as an intermediary between the people and the government. And I think that's a role that we can discharge effectively. And because we have the power to direct the government to do things once we are convinced that it needs to be done. So just a few of my thoughts on this. I would love to hear from the other panelists, and I'd be happy to take any questions after that. Thank you.